What is law? That's not often the question which is actually answered in any jurisprudence course at university, which generally will sell itself as a mean to tell you what law is. You might study something like Dawkins, or you might study something such as any number of people like Rousseau or so forth, and you come out of it with less knowledge about law than when you went into it. You might hear that life outside of civilization is short and brutal and unpleasant, or you might hear that human beings are inherently good, which to anyone who knows any human beings, or anyone who's ever met a toddler, is just not true. From very young, we as human beings are not inherently good. As one entomologist once commented, that communism was a great system, wrong species, in that ants might be able to cooperate in this good, selfless manner, but human beings simply can't. And when we do, it becomes something amazing, something which we talk about for centuries on end. And if you look at records of Catholic saints, for instance, in, say, Butler's Lives of Saints, people with lives which are good, but not utterly spectacular, are saints. They're considered people who are these good examples, because as human beings we aren't inherently good. You then get this idea of a social contract that at some point in the distant past, a government was formed by a contract between the people, and therefore this must be upheld centuries later by people who at best are ancestors of the individuals who made this contract, who were born into a system. And you then have stories like the Spelunkian explorers, and if people engage in cannibalism, is that wrong or right if they are not within the jurisdiction of the state, if they're on some island or in some cave where the state couldn't reach them at the time? Of course, Britain had a real example of this in the form of people who killed and ate a weaker member of a crew when they were shipwrecked. And I think they were stuck in a boat or something along those lines. So that really occurred, and I believe in that case the people were convicted. I think they might have gotten a royal pardon, if I can remember correctly. You also hear stories about the Siamese Twins, who had to be separated, but the separation would kill one of them. And so the doctors go to court to get permission to do so, and they give a one-off permission. You may do this one time, to try and avoid the usual process within common law where previous cases need to be respected. So you have this odd situation within jurisprudence where you're kind of either taught exceptions or you're taught things which are slightly nonsensical as origins of law. If you want to look at real origin of law, you might want to look at the Codex Juris Civilis. You might want to look at the history of Roman law, which deeply influenced the law of all of Europe and therefore almost all of the world, which at one point has been colonized or affected by Europe. You have the civil systems of law, which incorporated certain aspects of Roman law into their actual codified systems of law, which are quite detailed in some ways, and in others where they have a lot of judicial discretion, but it's still a civil law system. It's not this common law system of previous decisions have to be respected in a certain way. And when you get to European courts, you have a very specific way in which they operate, and international courts often don't have to respect previous decisions. So you have this complex sort of interaction between different legal systems. But when you get to English law, which is the other major system, you can again trace it back to history. You can trace it back to certain battles, certain kings, certain structures of rule. And in the case of Roman law, you can trace it back very clearly to the priestly class in Rome, to the manner in which they were able to decide cases based on what day of the week they were brought, and later where it became more complex, when the plebeian classes wanted more structure, where you have the office of the tribune set up, which eventually becomes the office of the emperor when the Roman Republic falls. You have a historic manner in which law evolved, in which what we call law came to be. And that historic manner is not what any of the jurisprudence origins will give you. Rome didn't originate because life without civilization is short and brutish. In fact, when you go to places where you have tribes which are uncontacted, often they quite enjoy their lives, and often if they get past the high childhood mortality, they can live to an old age. That's why villages often have elders. It's not to say that they live in a very just system, quite often they don't, but it's to say that our current legal system can't simply be justified based on these historic ideas. In English law, you get from the various kings, and the king, of course, has his right to rule from God, in a sense. Again, a religious origin. Law almost always comes from religion, to an extent that early jurists of the secular sort were trying to point out you can still have the concept without the religious basis. Our laws come from religion, and our laws come from superstition in the form of taboo. Something which is disgusting or revolting becomes law. You might say that law and morality have nothing to do with each other, but really, law is the morality of the legislator being forced upon everyone else, which is why so often when laws change, morality changes in society as well. So, what is law? Is it these God-given rights to us, as the Americans would have us believe? Is it a means of escaping the horrors of not being in a society, as the argument in Leviathan goes? Or is it something else? For me, we can't say that law is the will of the people, even in a democracy. You can't ever have it as the will of the people. You might have the will of the mob, or you might have the will of certain people, but it's never the will of the people of an entirety. You want to get to that. You want to get something close to that within a democracy, because that's the concept of democracy, of everyone having a say. That's the concept of a parliament, from the British idea of the king would actually listen to people below him speaking, and he would take into account what they do and govern with that in mind. And eventually the process became more and more complex. But the idea of listening to people is quite something, and yet in our modern societies we often don't let people have this absolute free speech that we might need to fully listen to them. We don't allow them to speak in the manner in which we might hear them. And if you are opposed to power or the structures of power, quite often those structures of power control the major media. They control the social media in the modern era as well as major media. You can't simply say things. You can't simply take positions. And if you do take those positions, often your entire life is halted. Often banks will refuse to do business with you, as places like Gab, the Christian Free Speech Network, has discovered, because as they allow what's legal speech in America on their network, a lot of banks will not do business with them, and so they have a problem. And so what we're actually looking at is not the will of the people. What we're actually looking at is not people speaking their mind and governing their places in that manner. And often you'll hear of the threat of populism. Populism simply means the will of the general people. So that's a threat, and it is a threat to those with political power, for the simple reason that law is not the will of the people. And simply because people don't overthrow their rulers doesn't mean that they are consenting to the will of their rulers, as in the case of some communist countries or dictatorships. Yes, law in a sense can be the fruit of an apple tree. You might find that a just society creates just laws and just rulers, and an unjust society creates the opposite, and sometimes you have a mixture between the two, either just rulers and an unjust society, or a just society and unjust rulers. So what is law? Well, you might say it's rules. Good point. And you might even say they're rules in force. And now, for something to be in force means quite literally that if you disobey it, you might firstly get something like a fine or a slap on the wrist, but eventually force will be applied on you. You will be forced to do something, or something will be forced upon you. And what that ultimate thing could be would be a bullet. What that ultimate thing would be could be the guillotine coming upon your head. So force is something which exists. Law is force. and its force, which is generally associated with some sort of rules. Now, you might have the case with it recorded within the Bible of a king of one of the kingdoms at the time in the Near East. I think it might have been Babylon or something, who had issued a rule that the Jews could be attacked at a certain day. And as he could not revoke his own laws, could not abrogate them, the only way he could undo that was to say the Jews could fight back. And therefore the Jews fought back and conquered their enemies within that context. But for something to be law, it generally has to be something which you can ascertain. It's something which you can come to terms with. But the reason we say that is that the laws which have lasted, the legal systems which have lasted longer, are the ones which work like that. It's much like evolution producing eyes in many different species in different times and in different ways, producing bodies which are the same on the left and the right, producing people in such a manner where you might have a genetic trait emerge many times. You might have something which is a reptile looking like a dolphin, or something which is a mammal looking like a crocodile. You have this way in which certain forms emerge because those forms survive. You do have systems within the past where despots ruled, and you do have small systems where despots rule. You recently had the Chaz emerge within America, this own little state which only was acknowledged by itself, but which was soon ruled by despots, and which soon had murder upon murder, and whoever committed the murders being difficult to find because it was not permitted that it could be said who committed the murders, and the evidence was covered up. And you've had a number of other such Paris Commune type states which have emerged but haven't really been states in the sense that they're not acknowledged by other states. And to become a state, you have to not only govern your own territory and have a monopoly on the use of force within it, or at least a monopoly on the regulation of the use of force, which makes more sense within it, but you also need to be acknowledged by other states. Who are other states? They are the powerful. They are those who themselves have force on their side. And that's what law is. Law is the culture around the use of force among those who have the power to use force. And that might seem odd, that might seem strange, but if you get your head around it, that a state is that which governs the use of force and which controls the use of force, it has a monopoly on the governance of the use of force, then surely that which a state does, which is unique to it, is the use of force and governance around the use of force. And so you might say that there's a lot of hypocrisy which goes on, whereby people with power break certain rules, while the poor who break them will go to jail for 15 years. The powerful who break them often will get community service or no punishment whatsoever. Why is that? Because the culture around those who are enforcing those laws in that country or that territory or that place is not being enforced upon their political class. It is not being enforced upon those who themselves have a say in the use of force, who have a say in the culture of the use of force, and who in that exclude themselves from it. You might find that in the argument of Leviathan, the lawmaker is not subject to law, but everyone else is subject to the lawmaker's law. You might find in Machiavellian arguments that law, the force of law, would be the manner in which people obey a ruler because of their power. And law isn't just about power. You have concepts of natural law, which are important. You have concepts of whether law is reasonable or not, and that's important. But concepts of natural law are things which you want included within the culture, which governs the use of force. You want people who are powerful to be governed by something else. You want your ruler to aspire to be Christ-like, to be like God, or to be like the highest ideal. You want your people in charge to believe that they themselves are governed so that they don't become despots. And yet, it's important to realize that law is the enforcement of the morality of the lawgiver. Law is the use of force. Law is the culture around the use of force among those who are powerful. And it isn't the governance of all people, it isn't the rule of reason, because you can often find a law is unreasonable. You can often find that people are put to death for leaving a certain religion. You might often find that people are jailed because they call their son and daughter by the name they gave them at birth, or by certain other things involved with that. And you'll see recent cases with that. I'm not going to specifically go into those specific issues because we don't live in a society which is quite so free. We live in a society where if I want to speak about the general, I got to be very careful about which specifics I say, or I myself will be silenced from speaking. But law, very specifically, is force. Now, you might have rules which aren't force. You might have guidelines which aren't force. But if at the end of the day, if you disobey a rule enough and you are steadfast in it, you land up being jailed or killed or having your limbs cut off or whatever else it is. That is the law. And a law can be incredibly unjust. But it's no good teaching lawyers that law can only be law if it adheres to liberalism or classical liberalism or Islam or whatever else it is. A law is simply that use of force. And what a lawyer does, and what someone who is involved in the legal system does, is they try to use that culture around the use of force, which exists among judges, which exists among police, which exists among politicians, to the benefit of their client. And that is the essence of what someone who's involved in the legal system does.